Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Royal Institution's live stream event this evening. I'm Hassan Al-Zafar. I'm the producer here at the ROI, and tonight I'll be also the host of this fantastic live stream, which I'm so excited to be part of. Today's guest is David Christian. He is formerly the Distinguished Professor of the History and the Director of the Big History Institute. He's delivered keynote conferences all over the world, including Davos, the World Economic Forum, and his TED Talk has been viewed over 19 million times. He's the author of numerous books, including the bestseller Origin Story. And here today to talk about his book, which actually came out some while ago, so definitely grab yourselves a copy, Future Stories. It is related at this point too to say that one of the most famous people in the world said that David Christian's approach to understanding history can help us all learn about the future, learn and prepare for the future. And that was Bill Gates. David Christian, it's wonderful to have you joining us here at the RI.
It's a real pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Well, let's dive straight in. I had the great privilege to be able to read your book, and you start off telling us, and please enlighten us a bit further on this. You're a historian, but you're looking towards the future, and that seems to be the entire opposite of what a historian is supposed to do. What made you feel, as a historian, you looking towards the future was something that you needed to do?
Well, big history is very much about crossing disciplines. And I guess one of the things that drove me to attempt a history of the whole of the past was the conviction that the barriers between disciplines block insights, that there's a huge illumination to be found by comparing the knowledge, the insights, the understanding of one discipline with that of another. So Big Bang, if you're a historian, you think about the past. Well, Big Bang cosmology can tell you about the past on the scale of 13.8 billion years. So what does that tell us as historians? So those sort of questions, which basically are not part of conventional historical thinking, have fascinated me for a long time. And if you pursue those questions, they lead you inevitably, I think, to the future. Let me tell you a brief story. When I think it was the second year of teaching big history, I didn't know what I was doing, I have to confess. And it was a bit of a mess, the course. And we gave a final lecture, which ended on, the day of the final lecture. And a very smart student came up to me and said she'd loved the course, but she said, you cannot leave us on a cliff edge. If you have looked at trends that long, you have to give us some guidance about where they are pointing. And from then on, every course in big history included some very tentative attempts to think about the future. And Future Stories really is an attempt to think those ideas through more thoroughly. But one other reason for a historian thinking about the future arises from questions like, I'm a professional historian, so questions like, what's the point of history worried me. There's great stories in history, but I think most historians would want to think that there's more to the history discipline than great stories. And writing this book, I realized a fundamental thing about our future thinking, that we have no information about the future, zero information about the future, no evidence, no documents. The only thing we can know is the past. But paradoxically, the only hints we have about the future lie in the past, because the past can point to trends of various kinds. And if we can identify pretty regular trends in the past, they provide powerful, not foolproof, but powerful hints about the future. I mean, people who bet on the horses do this all the time. But frankly, the fact that the sun has risen every day in the morning in my life is a powerful past trend. So I thought the separation between people who think about the future and people who think about the past is kind of crazy, because the only hints we have about the future arise from the past. So we need more of a dialogue between historians and, what should we call them, futurists, people who spend a lot of time thinking about the future. And one more point, if you look inside your head and you take the time to ask about the sort of stories and ideas floating around, you'll find very quickly that, I mean, I don't want to put a number on it, but the vast majority about the future. We were given brains to think about the future. We were given memories to help us think about the future. So most of our thinking is about the future. And that's one more reason why, whether you're a historian or whatever you are, you have to think about the future. We actually do it all the time. So perhaps we need to think more carefully about the future. That's a long rambling answer.
No, that's fantastic. Okay, it leads quite nicely to the next question. And by all means, if you're listening to this, please do join in the conversation by posting your questions in the chat. I've got a live view. The next question, because after you explained the very essence of why historians should be looking to the future and how, you know, the literal hints of the future lie in the past, you go on to explore the concept of time. And it's been one of the most fascinating concepts of time that I've been able to read. Let's just stick to the basics for now, and then you can build to your theory of time as a cocktail glass. But you start to say time as a map and time as a river. Can you tell us more about this?
Yeah, I thought of this book as I'm not a scientist, I'm not a mathematician. I thought of this book as a kind of generalist's guide to thinking about the future. And I realized very early on that I needed some clear ideas about time. Laughable though that ambition turned out to be. I don't think anyone has completely clear ideas about time. So I was trying, and throughout this book, I was trying to find ways of navigating sometimes very sophisticated and complex philosophy, theology, science, and to describe the payoff to that science or philosophy or theology in simple, vivid language. And over time, I became aware that many philosophers talk about two fundamental approaches to time. Now, they actually overlap. There's not a sort of hard and fast barrier between them, but the metaphors that are often used, and the metaphors I decided were quite helpful, were time as a river and time as a map. And time as a river is a way of trying to capture the sense of time that most of us have most of the time. So time flows like a river. It has a direction like a river. If we're floating down it, we know where we've been. We know something about the past, but we don't know where we're going. We don't know the future. It's turbulent. And one more thing about that metaphor for time, it captures the sense that we have limited control over the future, but we do have some control. So think of I use the metaphor of Huckleberry Finn floating down the Mississippi. If you're floating down a big river, you can actually put an oar into the water and change your direction slightly. And I think that captures perfectly our experience of time. The problem with this metaphor, time as a river, when philosophers start thinking about time in a much more rigorous way, or theologians, is it leads you to lots and lots of logical paradoxes. So philosophers and theologians have often been very dissatisfied with this notion of time. I mean, I could give you many examples. St. Augustine, for example, and I believe these paradoxes are explored very well within Muslim theological thinking as well. But I read Augustine's Confessions, which have a fabulous discussion of time. So he said, okay, so here's one problem. We experience the present moment. We don't experience the past. We don't experience the future. So when we're in the present, we have this sense of multiple possible futures. When we arrive there, we'll see only one future. So his question was, where are all of those multiple possible futures in the time before I get there? He said, are they sort of lurking in some sort of cupboard waiting to be released? And then the cupboard will release only one of them. That's one paradox. Another is the speed of time. how fast does time flow? Well, Newton had a theological answer, which was that God was provided a sort of, God's body provided a sort of framework for the universe, an absolute framework for space and time. So we could talk about the flow of time, but modern science has abandoned that notion ever since Einstein, really. So how can we measure the flow of time? There are many, many paradoxes. So philosophers and scientists very often prefer an alternative view of time, which actually is counterintuitive because it doesn't match our everyday experience so well. It's the idea of time as a sort of map of what the American philosopher William James called the block universe. And actually, Omar Khayyam writes beautifully. I was using the Fitzgerald translation, but he writes beautifully about the idea that the final moments of the universe can be predicted from the first moments of the universe. It's like a map. We don't expect it to change. And we can travel in any direction. And it's also hard to see what room there is for choice if time is a map. So that metaphor seems to point you in a kind of deterministic direction to the idea that there's no choice in the universe. So I ended up arguing in the book that we have to explore these two ways of thinking about time. And in practice, in our daily lives, we explore we use both of them in practice in a kind of messy way, because all of us have this sense that the future is sort of out there, a bit like time was a map. And all of us have the hope that secretly we may find some way of seeing the map in the future. But then in practice, the philosopher's attempts to understand what time is may not be that helpful for us human beings, because we are embedded in time. The idea of maps of time is sort of a God's eye view. And look, we are little creatures in a vast and mysterious universe. So most of the book, as it were, gives up on those philosophical and theological discussions of time and says we may need to borrow something from them, but let's go back to the reality of small organisms embedded in a local environment whose experience of time is much more like time as a river, and ask how they navigate the complexities of steering down that river.
Yeah. And you know, this is, we could do the entire session just on this. It's such a rich part to explore. We've actually had some questions come in.
Can I say, they are so fascinating, these discussions. Yeah. I had to resist getting lost in this kind of spooky philosophical forest. You know, it's full of, I think I say in the book, it's full of sort of philosophical creepy crawlies. But so I had to pull back and then ask the simpler questions about how we as living organisms actually cope with our experience of time. And
on that, let's move on to the third question that I had prepared for tonight, because it links very nicely to what you just talked about as us as organisms, and thinking of us in future thinking. You've already discussed, you touched upon it, but you discuss it in more detail in your book, the interplay between free will and determinism, and this compatibility between the two when you try to reconcile the concepts. Let's explore how you feel humans navigate decision makings within this framework, especially considering future uncertainties.
Yes. Again, it might help to think of me as a non-scientist trying to get to base one, trying to get my bearings on these absolutely fascinating and subtle problems. And so really what I'm describing is where I got to. That, you know, I'm sure there's further to go, but I did end up coming to positions that made some sort of sense. One of the things that came into focus when I was writing this book was something about the history of science. Science from the time of Newton until the late 19th century was extremely deterministic. In the early 19th century, the French mathematician Laplace said, if we had all the information necessary and the scientific laws, beginning with Newton's laws of gravitation, laws of motion, we could predict the entire future of the universe. Now, that's a profoundly deterministic way of looking at the world, and it's very compatible with the idea of time as a sort of map which is fixed and which we can't change, even if we travel through it in some sense. But in the 20th century, modern science has changed. It's got, how can I put it, softer or looser. Its understanding of how scientific laws work. This is true. This is generalization, I think, for most modern scientists, perhaps not all, but most. And there are several reasons for this. One is quantum theory, which seemed to show that at the smallest level, there's a sort of indeterminacy about reality. We can't lock it in with infinite precision. Chaos theory showed the same sort of thing, that tiny imprecisions like those that quantum theory guarantees get magnified as you go up the explanatory scale. And then the Austrian logician Kurt Gödel in his incompleteness theorems argued that even logic cannot be proved to be capable of offering complete proofs for all logical systems. So what that means is that the universe seems to work a bit more loosely than Laplace argued. The American philosopher William James, who I think I've already mentioned, puts it beautifully. He said, the parts of the universe seem to have a certain amount of loose play on each other. And what that means is that however much you know about the starting point for the universe, you can never guarantee that you can predict the way it's going to end up. There's a certain looseness there. Now, that looseness is what creates space for something like free will. I don't think anyone really understands what we mean by free will, but the best way of describing it is to say that living organisms seem to make choices. Rocks don't make choices, so it's irrelevant for rocks. But living organisms do seem to make choices. And what this means is that those choices matter. And Hassan, can I say what I personally think is the most powerful proof that something like choice is a reality? And strangely, it's not philosophical, it's biological. It is that the blind evolutionary process of natural selection has equipped all living organisms, beginning with bacteria, with ways of sensing the world. Now, that suggests to me two things. One, there is a world to be sensed. So that steers us away from extreme forms of anti-realism. But it's secondly, for the living organism, sensing that world with some degree of clarity matters, really matters. So that's really how I understand the idea of choice. And of course, the same thing is true of us. We are living organisms. We have a fantastically rich sensory equipment. And in the modern world, we've added to that sensory equipment, with collections of statistics, with computers, with the internet. So we have a staggering amount of information that we can use to detect trends in the past that may offer guidance in the future.
And on that, so in terms of, because you have an entire chapter dedicated to how cells manage the future, how plants and animals manage the future. And so let's look at that in terms of future management, from basic cellular decision-making to complex human choices. What understanding have you gained from the process of writing a book and your research of these processes? And how did those processes help us guide and make better decisions for the future of humanity?
As I was working on this book, this for me was one of the most satisfying and fascinating areas. And I think I was forced to, I came at this project with the idea that future thinking is something we humans, who are so damn clever, do very well. But the thought that bacteria, E. coli, might think about the future was nonsense. Then eventually I realized that actually the idea of natural selection presupposes, okay, let's be precise, not that they can think about the future, because they can't think, they don't even have neurons, but that they have some sort of mechanism for preparing for the future and taking bets on the future that are better than random. That idea, I think, is implicit in natural selection. Those organisms that, pick winners more often are the ones that are going to survive, and they're going to pass on the mechanisms that help them pick winners. So if you look at the simplest organisms we know with that question in mind, how do they predict the best future for them with two goals, survival and reproduction? Those are the goals. How do they do it? And it turns out that the biochemists in the last 50 years have teased out those mechanisms with immense subtlety. So while trying to avoid going too far down that particular rabbit hole, I felt obliged to try to give some feeling for how that machinery works in organisms so small that we cannot conceivably see them without a powerful microscope, because that is the foundation for all biological future thinking. Every cell in my body is thinking about the future in that metaphorical sense, of course. And my survival depends on every cell in my body getting it more or less right. If some of the cells go rogue and start multiplying in ways that are not helpful for the organism as a whole, that's a big problem for me. We call it cancer, of course. So that's the foundation for future thinking. So then when you get multicellular organisms, so that means that trees, of course, engage in future thinking. And again, we know many of the mechanisms by which they detect the seasons. Is this the time to invest energy in producing flowers or fruit or whatever it is? Multicellular organisms add one more level to all of this. Because if you have multicellular organisms, and in the book I said, if you want to think about the difference between E. coli and multicellular organisms, think about an ant crawling up the stairs of the Burj Khalifa in Dubai. That's the sort of difference we're talking about. So multicellular organisms have to add a new level, and that new level is collaborative. Every cell in a multicellular organism has to have not only mechanisms for predicting its own future, but also mechanisms for communicating and collaborating with millions of other cells. And in fact, if you look at the genes of multicellular organisms, you find that a hell of a lot of their genes, the genes that are different from E. coli, are genes for communication. Now, I like that idea partly because it's probably true, but also partly because it's a great metaphor for us humans today. We are becoming a kind of global organism. And if we're to survive, we're going to need to communicate and collaborate on a huge scale. And then the final point I'll make is just very quickly and very obviously is that animals are organisms with brains. Unlike trees, they move around the world, they try to eat other organisms, which is a complex challenge. So they need more powerful ways of creating scenarios about possible futures. And neurons and brains do that. But the future thinking that goes on in our brains is executive level. It's like what goes on in the cabinet of a government. Below that level, there are millions of individuals taking decisions. So our future thinking is taking the big executive decisions. I think I used the example of bungee jumping, which is something I'm never going to do. Will I go bungee jumping today? That's an executive decision which the brain can take.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions that have come in, so we're going to touch on them before we proceed to go to the questions that we had. Let's talk about, so we've got a lot of questions talking about the concept of immortality. So this idea that would our concepts of the future change, I guess is very hypothetical, if one was to pursue this idea of immortality, whether that's through whether that's through like organ donations, the idea that you could pursue it that way, or who got the idea of cyborgs and this idea that you do you think that, so the first question, it actually all got triggered by Fergus, who said, do you ever think that we'll be able to live forever, or at least a very long time? I guess there's a concept of time there for us, so 10,000 years is what he said. And what's the most likely way we could do it? And then Michelle, who added to that, said, what's your opinion of the future of humans? Do you think that we'll exist as cyborgs? I mean, the advent of AI, the idea of a subspecies taking space is not as outlandish as it once was. People integrating machines into them. I mean, one could argue that we're already there, partly. Let's just talk about that. Let's dwell on this. The idea of immortality, the idea of future of humans. If we live longer, does that affect our decision making?
Okay, so let me have a go at that. Immortality is not a theme that I sort of systematically explored, but absolutely fascinating and very relevant. So thanks for the questions. The idea of mortality is really more or less specific to multicellular organisms, because there's a sense in which bacteria can die, but they don't necessarily die. They sort of split and split and split. So in some sense, they are close to immortal. So that's one approach to this. But multicellular organisms all seem to be mortal. In the final parts of the book, I felt it would be, how can I put it, cowardly to write a book about the future and not stick my neck out and attempt some predictions. And I do so at three scales. One is the scale of the next 100 years. That's the scale at which my grandchildren will be alive. So it's personal, and it really matters. The second is the scale of many millennia, perhaps even millions of years. And the final one is the scale of the universe. The question you're asking probably belongs to the second scale, although we're already beginning to see very interesting changes. And now, I'm not going to claim to be an expert here. There are many people who make similar predictions, but for what it's worth, these are the predictions I found myself making. Very cautious predictions, of course, but one is that technological change will continue, maybe at an accelerating rate. And the reason for saying that is that technological change is a trend that goes back to the very beginnings of human history. So it would be absurd to think that technological change is going to suddenly stop. The second thing is we now know that a hell of a lot of technology is relevant to health, to longevity. In the 20th century, the average life expectancy of the world population has increased by almost 3 times. Now, that already is staggering. Better nutrition, better health, better medicine. But in the future, as you hint, we have very good reasons for thinking that trend will continue. I should confess that I'm a bit of a cyborg. I have a cochlear implant that was inserted 4 months ago. A plate was inserted inside my head, and it means I can hear in a way I couldn't hear before. It's absolutely amazing. Glasses, hearing aids. So we're already doing this. And so I think it is a very reasonable projection that in a few hundred years, people will be living fairly healthy lives for perhaps hundreds of years. And it is not a fantastic prediction to say that within perhaps just a few hundred years, death will be regarded not as an unavoidable conclusion, but something that only happens through accidents. Now, is that immortality? And there are sort of complex negative problems. Presumably, the very wealthy will get the first shot at longevity, as they will at brain implants for their children and things like that. So this is not necessarily this is not a scenario that's necessarily all good, but I think it's very likely. And so I think in 1,000 years' time, my prediction, for what it's worth, is that the human species will have begun diversifying. You'll find, and some of this will be along class lines, you'll have people who've had medical interventions that make them significantly different from others, sometimes because they're very wealthy. If we start migrating to other planets, which I think is very, very likely indeed, it's already happening, of course, then these medical interventions will be designed very much to help founders of colonies to live on those planets, to breathe different atmospheres, and so on and so on and so on. So in that limited and qualified sense, I think something like immortality is quite likely. And of course, many of these medical interventions will involve a sort of pairing of us with machines, maybe with artificial intelligence of some kind. So I came at this book, I must admit, as a historian, skeptical about some of the more, what seemed to be fantastic science fiction scenarios, but I ended up thinking they have to be taken pretty seriously because we can see the trends already.
And I guess one of the questions to build on that is there, let's just take healthcare as just a homogeneous issue for now. And is there examples from history that we can obviously point towards, where there has been a healthcare advancement and only a select few in society have been able to benefit from it, and it's taken that period of time for it to transcribe across the rest of the class, if you want to call it that?
Yeah.
And so, or in the event of, like, I'm guessing the obvious example for the advent of AI, for example, would be the Industrial Revolution, when you have a new technology and it's consolidated beginning in a particular class, and it eventually makes itself available to everybody else. What can we learn from those particular examples? Just pick one if you want, of how we can predict healthcare advancements going, and how we can predict technological advancements, and then also in particularly, what should we do differently? What didn't work well in those examples that points us towards, actually, if you want to create a more equitable society, we should do it this way?
Yeah, I think probably writing this book turned me into more of a technological optimist. In my research, I'm a Russian historian originally. I did research on the Russian peasantry in the 19th century and on their living standards and on their diets. And the difference between their levels of healthcare and those that are available, let's say, to the huge global middle class of today, are staggering. Even in a country like the US, we have evidence on the health of soldiers in the Civil War. They were all riddled with arthritis in their 30s and 40s. So that there has been a staggering positive improvement in the last 2 centuries. I think our health, we feel better, we are fed better. And again, I'm referring to a very large global middle class. The other side of it, of course, is that populations have grown so much that those who don't benefit are to be numbered in the billions. They are far more than suffered bleak lives 2 centuries ago, just because the population of the world is so much greater. I, as a Russian historian, I know Marx quite well, and I guess one of the fundamental ideas of socialism and of Marx was, which he tried to make a bit too rigid, I think, was simply that in societies, it is foolish for the elites to allow inequality to grow, to spread too widely. That is preparing an explosion, a social explosion. I've just been in Santiago, where many people were describing the sort of the huge near revolution of 4 or 5 years ago, and I think that's probably just one example of this. So the lesson, and this is a lesson for the people who have the most influence, I think, is that you cannot completely ignore issues of inequality. But also as a Russian historian, I think attempts to create by force or legislation a completely equal society could turn out in some ways to be as bad as the alternative. So navigating, using modern technologies to improve the lives of more and more people, limiting degrees of inequality will be crucial to the building of a good future. And in fact, I think the UN Sustainable Development Goals, it's easy to be cynical about them, but in some ways they're an astonishing document. And of course, they talk a lot about social welfare, about supporting those with the least wealth and supporting those who struggle. So the issue of equality looms large in them. What's astonishing about them is that every government in the United Nations, I believe this is true, has signed off on them. So there's a roadmap for a better future. And in my view, it shows that there is emerging a sort of global consensus about what we mean by global future, a good global future. It will navigate climate change, of course, but it will also navigate issues like global inequality of many, many, many kinds. That's my best shot at it.
That's a fantastic take on that. And the chat is absolutely exploding with questions, David. So let's go to and explore Luca, who sends you mentioned uncertainty in principles of the Gödel incompleteness principle, among others. I'm also thinking of the halting problem in incompatibility theory. Let's say quoting Plato's Elegy of the Cave. How lucky is it that we only see the shadows of the knowledge rather than the real knowledge? How lucky is it that we can perceive such reality because of our nature?
Right.
So to the question, I think it's so Plato's cave, the idea that we're sensing it, but we're sensing, if you're conforming to that school of thought, you're sensing only the shadows.
So yeah, thank you again. Thanks for the question. It's a good one. It's a very deep one. It's deeper than I'm qualified to answer, but I'll have a shot at it. It's a question I think about how, if we are trying to think sensibly about navigating the future, about building a better future, what sort of epistemological foundations should we start from? And I can tell you what seems to me the best foundation, and I think it aligns pretty well with some ways of interpreting Plato's allegory of the cave. And I think philosophers might describe it as perspectival realism. So I've already made the case for realism, that I think there are many reasons for not going too far down the anti-realist path. So for accepting there is a real world out there, and we don't need to believe that we can see that world clearly. All we need to believe to make sense of natural selection is that we can see enough of it and we can make enough sense of it as individuals for us to have a sporting chance of surviving and reproducing. So perspectival realism says there is a real world out there, but we see it through a keyhole. We only see a tiny part of it. And what we see is not always easy to interpret. So our job is to use that sliver of insight into the universe to learn just enough to increase our chances of survival. Now, there's a lot of serendipity here. I mean, it's like betting on the horses. Even very intelligent guesses on the future will occasionally not make it, and bad guesses will sometimes make it. But over time, this is a statistical process. Over time, those organisms that, again, like someone betting on the horses, have really done their homework. I had a friend who made a very good living betting on the horses. He put a lot of work into it. He studied the form. In other words, he did what is the fundamental rule of future thinking. You study the past, and what you look for is trends. Does this horse run well on wet courses or dry courses? Study them very carefully, and then placed his bets, and we all do that.
Mm.
We study past trends and we place our bets and we hope for the best. And we can be pretty sure that most of the time we'll do better than random.
Yeah.
So this is about sort of positioning ourselves epistemologically. There are no guarantees we'll get it right, but there is a difference between random decisions and decisions that are based on careful study of past trends. And that difference, which may sometimes be very small, is what natural selection builds on. And the whole apparatus of our bodies for preparing for the future builds on that tiny difference. So that's the best answer I can give. Oh, let me add one more thing. Perspective realism includes one more idea, which is a sort of instrumentalism. It's already implicit in what I've said. The ideas must work. They're not just neat or philosophically appropriate. They must work, and they must work in the crude biological sense that they help us survive.
On that, Sandra's asked this question twice, so I'm going to ask it for her. How do humans exercise free will, in your opinion, when our brains are controlled partly by predictable physics laws and partly by random quantum processes?
Sandra, thanks for the question. I don't know. I don't think anyone does. Honestly, free will. So I've tried to be quite careful in the way I put it. Living organisms face choices. They make choices, and it's a good bet that they are equipped with mechanisms to make better than random choices. But once you introduce the phrase free will, I have to say, I don't know what it means. So yes, all the choices we make, is there some kind of executive somewhere in my head who actually ponders all of this and comes up with a conclusion? I doubt it very much indeed. I think there's a hell of a lot of sort of neurological electricity firing in vastly complex networks in my head, and eventually something emerges that I experience as a decision. I mean, in fact, I know there have been psychological experiments recently whose payoff, if I've interpreted this rightly, is that very often you can detect the decision being made before the person is aware of having made a decision. So I must admit, I'm tempted to think that we're talking here about not deterministic processes, but then your question wasn't deterministic. Yes, a combination of this vastly sophisticated mechanism for making good choices and a lot of randomness.
That's Kang Lee has asked this question a number of times too. So this is interesting because it involves something that you touch about maybe a little bit, but it's time travel.
Yeah.
So do you think, now this is also a very hypothetical question because it starts with an if we are able to time travel to the past, do you think that any changes we make to the past will affect our present and subsequently our future? Do you think it will create a diverging timeline with new outcomes? Now, this is interesting because it points towards the ideas that you took towards the end of your book, of the multiverse and other theories. But let's talk about that, because you do mention at the end ideas, without spoiling things, like the what you refer to as human futures and remote futures and like the end of time from a scientific phase. And I think this fits into that. The multiverse was a dominant theory across the scientific world for some time, at least maybe a year or two. And some people still feel it's a dominant theory. So let's talk a bit about it.
Yeah, these are themes which, again, I'm going to give you a kind of dusty answer, because these are rabbit holes I went a little way down, but not too far down. The idea of the multiverse, my understanding is that it's a fascinating idea. It helps make sense of some cosmological problems, including the problem of why our universe seems to be so designed that it can allow the emergence of complex things like us. Because if you model universes, and I'm not even sure what that means, but people who've tried, many of their model universes are incredibly simple. They expand for a few seconds and they collapse. So why this sort of universe? The multiverse, the idea of the multiverse solves that problem in a way that I'm sometimes inclined to think is cheating. It says, well, let's imagine there are gazillions of universes. Then there are bound to be some which are quite complex. And if that's true, which allow complexity, if that's true, then it also follows that we will find ourselves in such a universe. I'm not sure that that solves anything, really. As for time travel, one of the things I did in the book, and again, I have to remind you, I'm a historian, not a scientist, and I'm a sort of mathematical idiot. I get lost at the point where I really ought to be following equations. But I tried in the book to explain Einstein's special theory of relativity. So I had a real shot at it. And one of the spooky consequences of his theory is that time travels in different ways for different observers. So this goes back to perspectival realism. If your perspective is different, then time will travel in different ways. And one of the consequences is that one observer may, in some sense, find themselves in the future of the other observer. If you've seen the film Interstellar, you've seen an example of this. Cooper goes through a black hole, which slows time for him, and he comes back younger than his daughter. So that's an idea that's implicit in Einstein's theory of relativity. But the idea that you got what's the Schwarzenegger film?
Terminator.
Series of Terminator. The Terminator films, the idea that you can go back and sort of correct the past or steer it in the direction you really wanted, I suspect is logically ruled out, because you may exist in my future in some sense, but if you try to get information to me from that future, by the time it reaches me, it won't be news any longer. Now, there are all sorts of paradoxes about this, but look, if I go any further, I'm going to start saying some very foolish things. This is the territory. These are the sort of spooky, philosophical, creepy crawlies that I was talking about earlier on. Things like time travel. But Einstein certainly forced us to take these sort of questions very, very seriously indeed. And indeed, Einstein's theory of relativity fits very well with the idea of time as a sort of map. And Einstein himself seems to have bought that idea of time as a map, and to have accepted a pretty deterministic view of the universe.
As Marty would say in Back to the Future, this is heavy.
Yeah, too heavy for me, let me say.
So there's a little debate kicking off in a respectable, really intellectual debate kicking off in the chat, which is about the multiverse. It's David Wood says the multiverse is by far the strongest theory of philosophy in quantum mechanics. It hasn't gone into any kind of retreat. The best single book of the multiverse, in his view, is Max Tegmark's. And then Sanders responded by saying, David, the multiverse is fundamentally unprovable, therefore cannot be determined by extermin. A string theory by any credible scientists is a coherent idea, but not provable scientific one. And they're both going to be right? The scientific, and this actually goes to what we were talking about earlier, sort of the philosophy of science and Thomas Kuhn's revolutions, scientific revolutions, the idea that, Einstein's theory of relativity replaced Newtonian gravity, and Newtonian gravity was good enough to get us to the moon. But when he got to quantum mechanics, it wasn't something that Einstein could see fitted well. So, I mean, feel free to come back on that point in terms of in terms of determining the future. The theory of science that we use to determine the future is also subject to change.
Yes, which takes me back to my argument about a sort of epistemological starting point for thinking about the future, which is perspectival relativism. And that means that when you look at time, it's very parallel to Einstein's argument. When you ask these questions really matters. At the moment, my understanding, and I'm not a physicist, so I stand to be corrected, but my understanding is that string theory absolutely fascinates the people who are mathematically literate enough to make sense of it, which I'm not. The idea of quantum gravity is absolutely fascinating. Desperate attempts to bring together quantum physics and relativity. At the moment, though, we have no experimental data that can test these things. We have no experimental data that can take us outside of our universe, which seems to have begun with the Big Bang. Now, I should add that places us in the 2020s. There are many cosmologists, physicists who are quite hopeful that a more powerful version of the particle accelerator, such as CERN, may actually give us hints about the existence of other universes. So there are lots of theories about what kind of evidence could give us hints. But my understanding is that at the moment, these are very, very nice and fascinating and interesting and sophisticated theories, but there is no evidential support for them. So they're nice ideas at the moment. They could suddenly turn into scientific ideas. And again, perspectival realism helps make sense of sudden shifts in science, like the shift in the 60s from a steady state universe to Big Bang cosmology, profound shift. But the discovery of the background microwave radiation persuaded the vast majority of cosmologists to go 180 degrees on the question of whether our universe is eternal and unchanging at large scales, or whether it has a history. I was delighted to when they agreed that it had a history, because that meant that me, as a historian, I could actually incorporate the universe in my attempt to describe the history of everything.
Let's bring the conversation back to future challenges. I think we spent a lot of time in Interstellar. So let's, you discuss in different perspectives of time. So you talk about natural time, psychological time, social time, and how these influence the ability for humans to plan for the future. Let's talk a bit about how these differing perspectives on time impact our ability to effectively manage and prepare for future.
Yeah. I think the question for me was, I'm increasingly convinced that we as a species are absolutely remarkable, that we're the first species in 4 billion years of life on Earth that has generated the sort of power we generate today. So today we're shaping the biosphere. And these arguments about how humans predict the future and why we may have more tools than other animals for predicting the future with more than random success. What are those tools? So I had sections on how bacteria predict the future, how plants do, how multicellular organisms with neurons do. And then there are 3 chapters on how humans do, because human future thinking, it's not a perfect phrase, but human future thinking has evolved, unlike that of clever species such as chimps or bonobos or gorillas or crows. It's evolved. And that has created many difficult puzzles. When we try to make sense of the view of time in small scale societies without writing, there were anthropologists in the early and mid 20th century who argued that their view of time is utterly different from ours. It's incompatible with ours. They see the universe as sort of static. They see history not as a kind of linear process, but as largely cyclical. They're also committed to the idea that the universe is full of spirits of various kinds, not just human beings. So in other words, to predict the future, you need to get in contact with the spirits. Today, we live in a very different world. So my problem was to explain why do humans think about time and apparently experience it in very, very different ways. And this idea of three different types of time that we experience, it's simply a way of trying to get at this. And so I argued that it's helpful to think of three different types of time that we experience. Natural time, that's the time of day and night, of the seasons, of the natural world. And we all experience it. Then the second is psychological time. That's the time in which, if you take acid, time seems to spool out in all sorts of complicated and unpredictable ways and go backwards and forwards and God knows where. It's a time when, if you're bored, time seems to go slowly. So psychological time, it is not like clock time. It's very flexible. And then finally, there's what I call social time. Social time is the time that we have to live by if we're going to meet someone at 11 o'clock tomorrow. I've just flown back from South America. So social time governs things like plane schedules. Thousands and thousands of people have to coordinate their activities in order to make sure that a plane lands at the right time. So my basic argument is that the balance of significance of these different types of power has shifted in the course of human history. In the small-scale societies that dominated the Paleolithic, it was actually very hard to detect a deep past. Oral memory could take you back a few generations, but the past seemed to kind of peter out in the distance. So it's a novel thing when some human societies began to really want to figure out what happened several hundred years ago, sometimes in order to prove that they owned this plot of land or that they were kin with these people and so on. So in those societies, time, there were very good reasons why time was experienced differently. Social time was very simple because scheduling means scheduling with 20, 30, 40 people. They're mostly within your community, so you don't need texts in order to schedule. You simply shout, oi, come over here. And then as societies got larger, they got more interconnected. And this is a very simple version of the story, but social time became more and more powerful in the sense that it shaped the way we think about time and the way we behave more and more powerfully. So again, international travel is a good example. If I travel from one country to another, my psychological time tells me, right now it's telling me actually, that the time is about 10 o'clock at night. I think I should check, but anyway, Santiago time. And my body is responding to that message. But social time tells me it's between 6 and 7 a.m. in Sydney. And which do I obey? Well, because I live in a fantastically networked society, I obey social time. And social time is clock time. It's because social time has become more and more important that we've developed mechanisms for coordinating the activities of different people. And they include calendars, clocks, the international dateline, all of which are quite recent inventions in terms of human history. So yeah, the idea of those three ways of experiencing time is really a way of trying to say that all human societies do experience the same things. It's a form of realism, but it's saying that the balance of those forces is different. So we shouldn't be surprised that they describe time in what sometimes seem utterly different ways.
And I think we've just gone over the hour mark, so that leads really nicely into something that we touched upon, Pete, in this conversation, but I really want to delve into it and really dig our teeth into it. And that is that you explore and you discuss and you talk about the concept of, as humanity, we've been able to gain an increased capacity to be able to shape our future. And we are now at many scientists will talk about the global challenges, but also just the unprecedented idea that we are now unforeseen, that we're in an era that we are now, humans are determining what's happening to our planet more than natural systems, some scientists would argue. Given the era that we are now in, allegedly, such challenges like climate change and societal disparities, how do you propose that individuals and societies approach that heightened responsibility, but also heightened impact to ensure that we can create a world which is more sustainable and equitable for all of us? And then particularly in the light of a conversation where we're talking about humanity existing 1,000 years from now, 100 years from now. For some people, you talk about time. If you go to a local climate march, people are telling you that time is running out. So how do you address those things from what you've explored?
God, wonderful questions, Hassan, and you'll have to stop me rabbiting on for too long. I take the idea of the Anthropocene very, very seriously, because looking at the whole of human history over several 100,000 years, I think what you see is the first species in 4 billion years in which individuals share information with such power, such precision, and in such volume that information can accumulate across generations. Now, that is not true of chimps, of dolphins, of other brainy species. We have no evidence that their technologies, the amount of information they have, increases. Now, add one more thing. Information is power. The more information you have, the better you can predict what's going to happen. The better your chances of prediction. Information is power in the most obvious senses. I mean, information about how to split the atom is the power that made it possible to create nuclear weapons. This is not all good. It's very, very ambiguous. And over the course of human history, our technological or ecological power, collectively, of course, it's always a collective phenomenon, has accelerated, and it's grown incredibly rapidly, particularly in the last few hundred years, with a speed that I think most people aren't aware of. In my lifetime, the population of humans has, I should check this, but I believe it's tripled in just my lifetime. So I take the idea of the Anthropocene very seriously. Suddenly, we realize that our collective impacts on the biosphere are on the same scale as those of global systems, of geology, of the climate system. So that means our future thinking faces new challenges, but they're collective challenges. So the question that I see is, can we as humans develop a sense of collective responsibility, develop the sense that we're all in this together fast enough and efficiently enough for individuals, institutions, governments around the world to collaborate with some degree of effectiveness on a future which is good for my grandchildren and for the grandchildren, for future generations. And that means the issue of a sense of belonging to a single global humanity becomes immensely important. Now, it may sound naive to talk about something like global citizenship, but it really shouldn't, because if you think about it, national citizenship, which we take for granted, is a weird idea. When you think of nationalism, millions of people will have a sense of being members of the same community, and that sense of belonging to the same community will encourage actions that include self-sacrifice. I'm thinking of, soldiers who sacrifice themselves, ambulance carriers, stretcher bearers during the First World War. God knows, the people, the medics working in Gaza today, my mind is staggered by thinking about that. So the question is, can we develop a sense of consciousness as members of a single, now global species, in the way we once developed a sense of consciousness as members of tribes or nation states? And I don't know the answer, but I think what is very clear is if we can't do that, then future generations are in for a very rough ride. And anyone who cares about the fate of people we know now, young people we know now. I have a gorgeous 2.5-year-old granddaughter. I think a lot about her. So can we develop that sense of consciousness as members of a single global species? Having said that, just one more point I'd like to make, Hassan, which is that in pursuing these sort of goals, it's very easy to be pessimistic. Describing dystopias is frankly much more fun and much easier than describing utopias, good futures. So no wonder, most science fiction films describe dystopias, horrible futures. And of course, the media loves bad stories. So the media highlights the horrible things that are going on in the world and creates what I frankly think is an illusory picture of the world. It kind of censors out the vast numbers of people doing good things, the doctors of Médecins Sans Frontières, just to pick a random example, the work of the Red Cross and the Red Crescent, things like this. So I think that we have to resist pessimism. There are good reasons why pessimism is so dominant. There are neurological reasons, by the way. We're designed by natural selection to respond more violently to bad news or dangerous news than to good news. So that means, if I'm right, it's the great challenge we face today is to maintain optimism about the future. After all, pessimism leads you nowhere. If someone says, we're done, we're finished, where does that get us? We don't know that we're finished. There may be plenty of opportunities for building a good future, and our job is to look for them and fight for them. So I believe that optimism is one of the tools of building a better future. It's not just a decision we take. It's one of the tools for building a better future. Sorry, that was a long, rambling answer, Hassan.
They're really beautiful, because we do get a lot of people who are very pessimistic. I mean, we have, and I hope he won't mention, he won't mind I mention him. He was in the RY just about a couple of weeks ago, Slavoj Žižek, and his latest book, Too Late to Awaken, where he basically said, look, I believe that things are not going to go well. And someone said to him, but what about the young people? What would you say to them? And he would say, well, you're asking me to either do two things. You're either asking me to lie to them or to tell them the truth. But I feel like what you're mentioning is that it's easy to think that things are going to go south and things are going to be really bad. And like you said, that dystopias are humans seem to be much more fascinated with dystopias than they are with utopias. Because I think at this point is sort of like to add substance to this. Let's use history. Is there historical examples that you can say that humans felt that things were going to go down south? That you could arguably say there was a collective human society where they were like, it ain't going to get any better than this, and they were proven wrong.
Well, there are plenty of examples of situations that seemed utterly catastrophic, where, and they're not all situations that I might like or you might like, where leaders said, we can get through this. So that's, well, I'm thinking of Ukraine. Zelensky's rhetoric is an immensely important part of what's going on in the war between Russia and Ukraine. And his rhetoric can give hope to Ukrainians. We don't know if he's right. He may be wrong. But in the what's better to just cave in, or to fight? And that's I'm not saying there's an obvious answer. It's a complex, very complex question. But there've been, I think, many situations. And let me give you actually a very different kind of example. And in the book, I talk about Condorcet, the 18th century philosopher who eventually died in prison during the French Revolution, that he left behind a manuscript describing a future, and it was a utopian future. And at the time he wrote it, it talked about increasing life expectancy, increasing health, and so on and so on. It sounded completely, totally, utterly naive. If you check Condorcet's manuscript against what happened in the next 200 years, it turns out that technology is advanced and I'm talking about positive technologies for improving health, for improving education. We live in a world, for example, in which slavery exists, God knows, but for the first time in thousands of years, slavery is regarded as bad, as illegal, in which extreme gender inequalities still exist. But the positive thing is, for the first time in thousands of years, that's regarded as a problem to be solved. So, yeah, if you look for optimistic outcomes, there are many, many examples. But I come back to the crucial thing. If you predict a catastrophe in the near future, and your prediction demotivates positive action towards building a future, then that is a self-fulfilling prediction of the worst possible kind. So we do not know that the future is catastrophic. In fact, there's plenty of evidence that we as a species have staggering technological, but also social creativity. So our job is to look for the positives because they're surely there. We can't guarantee that they will save us from a bad outcome, but by gosh, if we don't look for them, we'll never find them. So I believe optimism is, as I said earlier, it's a tool for building a better future. And it includes optimism about things like the possibility of an emerging sense of a global community. I think there are many illustrations of this. You have another earthquake in Afghanistan. Individual people, not always wealthy people, will reach into their pockets and donate to it all around the world. Now, 200 years ago, that would have been utterly unthinkable. The Sustainable Development Goals, again, you can be very cynical about them, but there has been an agreed sort of roadmap on a good future. It's very profoundly moral, if you look at it. So there is emerging a kind of moral consensus about where we need to go. If you look at discussions between different religious traditions, of course, there are clashes. There are still clashes, but many of those discussions are actually very positive. And in fact, there was I think I mentioned it in the book, in 1994, a Council of World Churches issued a declaration saying, as we look at different religious traditions, we find beneath the surface differences, which are many, we find deep commonalities about what we mean by a good life, what is good behavior. So I see evidence of global moral convergence. On how we describe the world, that convergence is already powerful. Science and related disciplines dominate modern education throughout the world. Now, science doesn't have a great moral role to play yet, although in issues like climate change, it's beginning to, because the information has moral significance. So I'll stop there. But
no, we are coming towards the end of our really, really wonderful conversation, and I wish it could go on longer. Your book is available in all good bookstores right now. I want to point towards something to wrap things up. 19 million copies sold worldwide. What do you think it was that made people really draw towards this book? And also, do you think there's a trilogy in there? Do you think there's another one to come after this? Do you feel that there's something inside you? It's like there's something else to say?
Hassan, I think there've been 19 million copies of my TED Talk. 19 million viewers of the TED Talk. A Future Stories has. I wish it had. Oh my God, I wish it had.
Maybe after this talk, maybe.
I have to say, I loved writing it, and I feel that I've learned a lot about the future. I think there are things to be said without falling into the naive trap of thinking that if we're clever enough, we can predict the future with absolute confidence. We'll never be able to do that. But our chances of getting our predictions right are increasing. And that really matters, because now what's at stake is not the fate of a small community or even a national community, but a global community. So that clear future thinking is incredibly important, and lots and lots of people are doing it with great sophistication and great skill. And the most obvious example is the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, but there are many examples. So future thinking there's a hell of a lot of it going on. Yeah, I wish it was taught in universities and schools, because after all, we spend most of our lives thinking about the future. So we need to give young people, some of the tools that are available to think about the future.
Thank you ever so much, David.